He said it's longer than the boat. And the boat was almost like 32-footer, end to end.
The truth about Alaska's Lake Iliamna Giants is out, and scientists are terrified. What began as a quiet study has erupted into panic.
Is there a monster in Loch Ness? Today, a new mission was launched to find out, with hordes of researchers and Nessie enthusiasts descending on the Scottish lake.
After leaked data revealed something alive beneath the ice, something ancient and predatory. Pilots have seen the shadows. Fishermen have vanished without a sound.
Well, there's been a lot of stories from people around these parts. There's got to be stuff out there that we don't know about yet.
Now, environmental DNA has just confirmed what the government tried to bury. The shadows beneath the ice. It began with a radio transmission that ended too soon. In the winter of 1987, a bush pilot prepared for takeoff from the frozen edge of Lake Iliamna. He was an experienced man who had flown the same route dozens of times. The weather was calm and visibility was good. But moments before he lifted off, he reported something strange to the control tower. His voice was steady at first, then uncertain. He said a dark shape was moving beneath his floats, large enough to block the light through the ice. He described it as a shadow bigger than the plane that was pacing him in the water. The transmission ended mid-sentence. The aircraft disappeared from radar minutes later, and no trace of wreckage was ever recovered. Stories like his are not rare in that part of Alaska. Lake Iliamna stretches for nearly 1,000 square miles, large enough to form its own weather patterns. Winds can rise out of nowhere, twisting the surface into violent waves that can destroy small aircraft trying to land. The lake's depth remains uncertain even today. Some sonar surveys stop recording at 1,000 feet because the signals cannot penetrate the dense layers of silt and glacial debris. The water is close to freezing for most of the year and turns pitch black beyond the top few feet. Visibility is almost zero once you go down. To fly or sail across Iliamna is to move over a void that has never been properly explored. Long before pilots began reporting strange things, the Dena'ina people told warnings about the lake. They spoke of powerful beings that lived beneath the ice, creatures that punished anyone who disturbed their home. Some called them water spirits. Others described them as living shadows that could pull a full-grown caribou through the ice without breaking the surface. For the Dena'ina, the rule was simple. Do not stay on the frozen lake too long and never look down when the water moves by itself. Many outside observers once dismissed these stories as superstition, but the reports that came later forced even skeptical people to listen again. After a series of unexplained crashes in the late 1950s, the government launched a quiet investigation into what was happening around Iliamna. A small team of federal scientists and aviation experts was assembled. They were told to treat the matter as a potential aviation hazard and to keep their findings confidential. Over several years, they gathered accident reports, sonar readings, and testimony from local pilots and fishermen. The material was combined into what became known internally as the JAWS files. The name came from a comment in one of the early reports that described the lake as Alaska's own JAWS, something massive and alive. The documents were labeled as restricted and later sealed. They described sightings of immense dark forms rising beneath plains, unexplained collisions on calm water, and entire boats vanishing without distress calls. Some included notes from wildlife officers who had found animal carcasses torn open in strange ways, the wounds unlike any known predator attack. One summary page ordered the suspension of all public discussion of the subject. The wording was brief and unsettling. Suspend public inquiry. Avoid panic. In early 2023, after decades of silence, copies of several classified reports began circulating quietly among retired pilots and researchers. No one knew who released them. Some claimed they came from an anonymous source inside the aviation archives. Others said they were discovered in a private estate collection. The authenticity was never officially confirmed, but every document carried matching stamps and dates from the original investigation. The release of the leaked pages did more than expose forgotten government documents. It reopened every wound the lake had carved into Alaska's history. The missing planes of Iliamna. After the 1987 disappearance, the one that ended with a pilot's voice cut off mid-sentence, fear spread quietly through Alaska's aviation circles. Other pilots began to speak of their own encounters, stories they had never reported because they knew no one would believe them. They talked about engines cutting out for no reason and restarting only after a few minutes of silence. Some described a deep vibration rising through the fuselage, a humming that came from the water itself. Others claimed to have seen a dark mass keeping pace with them under the surface as they taxied for takeoff. None of these reports ever reached the public. Each one went straight into a folder stamped with the same confidential insignia found on the newly leaked pages. When investigators finally reviewed decades of accident data, they found a pattern that could not be explained by weather or human error. From 1950 through 2010, at least 5 aircraft and 6 fishing vessels had vanished while crossing Lake Iliamna. None sent distress signals. Every case occurred in the same broad area near the lake's center. The pattern was too precise to dismiss. On a map, the coordinates formed an oval-shaped zone where depth readings were inconsistent and sonar returns came back blurred. Divers who had participated in recovery efforts described what they found in that region, and their accounts were far more disturbing than the official reports suggested. The fragments they brought up were not shredded by impact or corroded by time. They were crushed inward, as though a tremendous pressure had gripped the aircraft from both sides. One diver said that the aluminum looked as if it had been squeezed like a can. Another refused to return to the water after his first descent, saying the darkness below felt alive and aware. Several of these statements appear in the same confidential collection of reports that people later called the Jaws files. As these details emerged, old local beliefs began to resurface too. Fishermen and residents who had lived near the lake for generations repeated what their grandparents had told them. They said the water sometimes feeds and that engines disturb it. To protect themselves, families began hanging small metal charms shaped like airplane propellers or fish over their doors. They said the charms confused whatever moved below, keeping it from following the sound of engines back to shore. By the late 1970s, the internal investigation known as Project Iliad had already mapped these disappearances. Analysts drew overlapping circles on navigational charts, marking the exact coordinates where wreckage had been found, or where aircraft had vanished without a trace. Every circle fell within the same deep water depression that scientists now believe was formed by glacial movement thousands of years ago. Yet the charts included something strange: magnetic anomalies recorded at inconsistent intervals, as if the readings themselves were shifting. When those findings reached the higher offices that funded the research, the anomaly data was removed before the reports were made public. The edited version spoke only of unstable sediments and visibility problems, but the unaltered records in the leaked documents told a darker story. They implied that something large enough to distort magnetic readings might be moving below the lakebed itself. As modern scientists began planning new sonar studies decades later, they were unaware that the same area had been charted long before them. The coordinates they chose matched the old restricted zones from the confidential maps. When their instruments descended into that darkness, the results would force them to confront what earlier investigators had refused to record in plain language: The sonar that saw too much. In 2010, a federally funded seismic research team arrived at Lake Iliamna to conduct a mapping study. Their mission was purely geological. They were tasked with charting earthquake fault lines and analyzing how glacial sediments shifted beneath Alaska's largest inland body of water. The work was routine, the kind of project that rarely attracted attention. The group expected to finish in a few weeks and leave behind nothing more than clean sonar charts and temperature readings. The team began scanning during the early thaw, when the ice was thin enough for their equipment to operate, but the lake still hovered near freezing. They deployed a submersible drone outfitted with high-frequency sonar, thermal sensors, and magnetometers. The first few days produced normal geological data: smooth slopes, dense silt beds, and clear seismic lines. Then, during a scan near the middle of the lake, one of the monitors detected movement. At first, they assumed it was a technical error. 3 distinct shapes appeared on the sonar, each over 40 feet long, gliding together in near-perfect formation. The readings were steady, not random bursts. When the drone changed direction, the shapes followed, circling the submersible before retreating into deeper water. The team recalibrated their system and ran another pass. The same 3 shapes appeared again, moving slower this time, maintaining even spacing as if following one another. The thermal sensors made the discovery harder to dismiss. The shapes emitted faint but consistent heat signatures. At depths near 180 feet, where the water temperature was barely above freezing, nothing known to science should give off that kind of warmth. The team double-checked their instruments. The sensors were functioning correctly. Whatever was down there was alive, generating heat, and large enough to dwarf the submersible. When the team reviewed the footage later that evening, one technician became visibly shaken. The sonar's contour imaging showed what looked like a ridged skull at the front of one of the shapes, broad, uneven, and tapering toward a pointed snout. It resembled a sturgeon's head, but was far larger and oddly structured. The data replay showed brief flashes of movement that suggested flexibility, not rigid bone. One operator described it quietly as something that shouldn't be swimming here. The following day, the team filed an internal report describing the readings as unidentified biological mass. The report triggered a response from the project supervisors, who instructed them to classify the results as instrument irregularity and to stop all discussion of the event. Within 24 hours, all recordings were secured and cataloged. The researchers were told their contract had been completed ahead of schedule. No explanation was given. Several weeks later, still images from the sonar began to appear in private research circles. No one knew who released them. The images were grainy, but clear enough to show 3 massive forms moving in formation across the bottom of the lake. Independent analysts compared the shapes to diagrams that appeared in the leaked pages of the JAWS files. The resemblance was exact: the same alignment, the same estimated size, and the same temperature differential noted decades earlier. Whatever had been recorded in the 1960s was still present, unchanged. Scientists who studied the leaked images tried to explain them away. Some said the sonar might have captured logs moving along current lines. Others blamed equipment interference caused by the mineral-rich silt. But the consistent spacing and synchronized movement were difficult to dismiss. One sonar specialist who viewed the data later remarked, "That was not debris. It moved with intent 2010. After the recordings were classified, no further surveys were permitted in the central section of Lake Iliamna. Requests for access to the 2010 data were denied. Several of the original operators resigned from subsequent government work, and none spoke publicly about what they had seen. The files disappeared again, folded back into a long history of silence. For a while, the story faded. Funding for new studies dried up, and the unexplained anomalies were written off as mechanical faults. The only trace that remained was a few copied images and whispered rumors spreading through nearby villages. Then, within 2 years, the fear returned when something horrifying began happening. The fishermen who never came back. By the winter of 2018, the events of the 2010 sonar study had faded from memory. Then, one calm afternoon near Pedro Bay, the lake reminded everyone that it was not done. 2 subsistence fishermen, both lifelong residents of the area, set out onto the ice to check their lines. The weather was stable and the air was clear. When they failed to return by evening, their families went out searching. What they found the next morning looked wrong even to people who had lived beside the lake all their lives. The men's canoe had drifted up against the shore, half submerged in a thin crust of ice. Its wooden hull was scarred with deep parallel grooves, as if something enormous had dragged claws or teeth across it. Their fishing gear was scattered across the ice in a rough trail that led toward open water. Rescue teams from the nearest village arrived a day later and began scanning the area. They found dark patches frozen into the surface that looked like old oil, but closer inspection showed they were mixed with blood. The streaks stretched outward from the damaged canoe, stopping at a wide hole where the ice had collapsed inward. The water below was silent and opaque. It looked as though something had broken through from beneath and then sealed itself again. The official report listed the cause as an ice accident. The word attack did not appear anywhere in the paperwork. Weeks later, fragments of human remains washed up along the lake's outlet channel. A state biologist was sent to assist with identification. He examined what little was recovered and noted fractures in the bones that suggested a powerful compressive force. They were not typical of drowning or freezing injuries. In his private notes, which were later found referenced in an archived field log, he compared the damage to photographs from the old JAWS files. At the bottom of the page, he wrote a single line: "Same signature as 1967 samples." The note never became part of the official investigation. The story appeared briefly in a regional bulletin and then disappeared from public attention. In Alaska's interior, 2 missing fishermen in winter is not unusual. The area's isolation and the routine danger of ice travel made the explanation convenient. Outside the village, almost no one heard about the details: the gouged hull, the trail of frozen residue, or the missing men. For the people who lived there, the silence was worse than the event itself. According to local accounts, the lake changed after that winter. Fishing traps along the shoreline came up empty. Seals that usually surfaced near the ice holes stopped appearing. Even the birds that followed the water routes avoided the area. Elders said the lake had fed before it slept. Some of the younger men began refusing to fish after dark, saying they heard vibrations under the ice, a faint thrumming that made the surface ripple without wind. Local authorities responded quietly. Instead of an investigation, they reportedly issued new safety advisories that banned night fishing and winter travel across specific sections of the lake, citing unstable ice conditions. The warnings mentioned no names or details, but the restricted zones matched the same coordinates where the sonar anomalies had been recorded years earlier. Locals noticed the pattern immediately. The deaths created quiet panic among the few scientists who still followed the Iliamna mystery. They had spent years reviewing the leaked sonar images, the faded diagrams, and the accident maps. If people were now dying near the same coordinates, then the evidence could no longer be dismissed as myth. But proving that something was alive in the lake required more than rumor, sonar, or broken metal. They needed biological proof, something that could survive scrutiny in a laboratory. In early 2021, independent researchers began organizing a new field study. Their plan was simple: collect water samples from across the lake and analyze them for traces of environmental DNA. Environmental DNA refers to the genetic material that living organisms shed into their surroundings. Fish release it through their skin, waste, and mucus. Mammals leave it through hair and bodily fluids. Even small traces of tissue can stay suspended in water for weeks. By filtering water samples and analyzing them in a laboratory, scientists can detect species that are present without ever seeing them. If anything enormous lived in that water, its genetic signature would be impossible to hide. For the people living near Iliamna, the preparations stirred mixed emotions. Some hoped the scientists would finally end the fear that hung over their communities. Others warned that disturbing the lake again would bring more deaths. The researchers moved ahead anyway. They would launch in the thaw of 2021, carrying the tools that could confirm once and for all if there was truly some monster beneath the sea. The experiment: extracting the truth. The Iliamna team began collecting samples at several points around the lake during spring, when the ice had finally melted, but the water still felt like glass over stone, clear, bitterly cold, and impossibly deep. Every movement of their boat sent echoes through the still air. They worked carefully, speaking in short, practical tones to keep focus. The process demanded precision. Each sample bottle had to be rinsed, sealed, labeled, and logged. Every coordinate, time, and temperature reading was written by hand, then entered into a shared database. They followed every protocol they knew to prevent contamination, but beneath their professionalism was a quiet unease. The lake was calm, yet its silence felt wrong. At first, the results looked ordinary. Early lab tests confirmed the presence of salmon, trout, and freshwater seals, the same ecosystem patterns that had been recorded for decades. There was even a hint of relief among the team. For once, the stories might finally be overblown myths, nothing more. But as the next series of samples arrived, the atmosphere in the lab changed. A single repeating genetic fragment appeared in samples collected from different sites, some separated by more than 20 miles. It came from a vertebrate, an animal with a backbone, but the sequence didn't match any fish, mammal, or reptile listed in North American databases. The lead researcher, Dr. Varro, quickly ordered another round of tests using completely new filters and sterilized equipment. No one argued, though several team members whispered privately that they didn't want to go back onto the lake. When the same strange sequence appeared again, the room fell silent. They all stared at the data screen. One biologist, who had worked on marine surveys for 20 years, muttered that it looked engineered. Another said nothing at all, just pushed her chair away and went outside to breathe. The repetition ruled out contamination, and that realization made everyone uneasy. Dr. Varro wrote everything down, every result, every observation, but her tone changed in the logs. Her notes included a new detail: the faint smell of metal from the filters after each sample run. She recorded it clinically, calling it a reaction to the lake's mineral content, but the smell stayed in her mind. 2 nights later, she mentioned to a colleague that it reminded her of blood. When the team submitted their preliminary findings, they expected collaboration, not resistance. Instead, their data was quietly redirected to a federal environmental office that handled aquatic monitoring programs. They received a single email thanking them for their valuable contribution and informing them that the material was being consolidated for official evaluation. Within days, their shared database credentials stopped working. Frustration gave way to fear. One scientist slammed his laptop shut and said it was happening all over again. The same pattern of silence that haunted the old reports. Their liaison offered only vague assurances, explaining that the review process could take months. The official correspondence grew colder, filled with phrases like instrument review and pending classification. Those words matched lines from the old JAWS files, almost word for word. The realization hit them like a weight. The same machinery that had buried the truth half a century earlier was moving again. One member of the team, driven by anger and fear that their work would vanish, copied a set of the raw sequences onto an external drive before the system locked them out completely. Those saved fragments would later uncover what the lake had hidden for generations. What had started as cautious science was about to become undeniable proof that something alive, something ancient, still moved beneath Lake Iliamna. The genetic anomaly no one can explain. When the copied sequences were analyzed independently, the data showed genetic markers that should not coexist in any living organism. The code contained elements linked to sharks, sturgeons, and cold-blooded reptiles. Each of those lineages separated millions of years ago, yet here they appeared joined inside a single, repeating genetic structure. The scientists reviewing the fragments could not explain what they were seeing. One molecular biologist finally described it as a biological contradiction, and no one disagreed. The mitochondrial section of the sequence created even more confusion. It aligned closely with the genomes of deep-sea apex predators, species adapted to life under extreme pressure and complete darkness. Another portion matched fragments from fossilized marine species that lived during the Pliocene epoch. If correct, that meant part of the code belonged to a lineage that had vanished roughly 3 million years ago. For weeks, the researchers debated possible explanations. A few believed it might be ancient sediment contamination. Others rejected that immediately, arguing that the samples were far too intact and consistent across separate sites. The same pattern appeared no matter where the samples had come from. The laboratory residue from the filters added another layer of unease. When placed under ultraviolet light, it emitted a faint, uniform reflection. It was not bright enough to be called a glow, but it was distinct and repeated in every test. At first, the team assumed the reflection came from minerals reacting to the cleaning chemicals used on the filters. When the effect persisted under controlled conditions, the explanation stopped making sense. The technicians became uncomfortable running tests after dark. Several reported that the odor of the residue had changed as it dried. What once smelled faintly metallic now reminded them of burnt iron and, as one person put it, something organic that shouldn't be warm. Tension began to replace curiosity. People who had worked side by side for years stopped trusting each other's interpretations. Some wanted to publish the findings immediately, believing it would confirm a major discovery. Others warned that releasing such data without explanation could destroy their reputations. A few questioned whether they were even looking at a living organism. "It's a mistake," one technician said quietly. "Because if it isn't, then we've just proven something that shouldn't be alive." An internal memo was written to summarize the data for peer review. Its language was cautious, calling the material possible evidence of evolutionary memory. The phrase suggested that certain organisms might retain ancient marine traits long after their ancestors had vanished. To the team, that sounded more like an effort to make the findings sound safe. The structure they had recorded didn't resemble dormant genes. It looked active, organized, and functional. By the time the report was finished, no one in the lab spoke confidently about what they had found. The data no longer fit within any evolutionary framework they knew. The unanswered question was no longer whether the DNA was real. It was what kind of living creature could leave it behind. That question drove the next phase of the investigation, where an explosive discovery awaited them. The giants are real, and they're still feeding. When the independent analysts compared the Iliamna genetic data to known fossil records, the results overturned everything science understood about what could survive in fresh water. The sequences revealed a 62% match to Carcharicles megalodon, the prehistoric shark that once ruled the ancient seas. The remaining code showed clear evidence of adaptation to cold inland waters, with metabolic traits found in species that thrive beneath ice and structural genes similar to the armor plating of ancient sturgeons. The evidence was clear and specific. The samples did not belong to a decayed fossil or an extinct lineage. They represented the living blueprint of a predator that had evolved in isolation for millions of years. As the data expanded, the shock deepened. The sequences contained 6 distinct genetic variations, known as haplotypes, meaning they came from multiple individuals. That finding destroyed the last possibility that this was a lab error or contamination. It pointed instead to a small breeding population living somewhere within the lake. The researchers who had spent months searching for biological answers sat in stunned silence as they realized what this meant. They were not studying fragments from the past. They had found proof of an active species that had survived extinction by retreating into an isolated freshwater world where no one had ever looked closely enough to find it. The implications spread quickly among the team. Some scientists felt a surge of wonder at what they had confirmed, while others grew visibly uneasy. They spoke about balance and what might happen if a top-level predator reappeared in an ecosystem unprepared for it. Several of them stopped sleeping well. They had all seen the sonar scans and the crushed metal recovered from the earlier crashes. Now they could connect the patterns. The same enormous species that had left its genetic trace in the water was responsible for the disappearances and the attacks. Its hunting behavior explained the gouged hulls, the torn fuselage fragments, and the missing men. The genetic data also offered a reason for the strange disturbances that locals described in the water. The creatures moved slowly, relying on minimal metabolism to survive in cold depths, but when awakened by sound or vibration, they became active hunters. The rumbling felt beneath the ice and the periodic vanishing of fish were no longer mysteries. They were signs of the predators feeding. It became clear that sonar studies and engine noise had drawn them upward. Each new human intrusion into the lake had triggered another appearance. A few weeks later, new shoreline samples taken near small settlements showed the same DNA. The results meant the creatures were no longer confined to the trench. They had moved closer to human activity. The finding should have set off public warnings, but it didn't. Inside the research group, debate turned to fear. If they announced that a living population of prehistoric predators existed in a lake used for fishing, transport, and drinking water, they would face global attention, lawsuits, and economic chaos. The area would be closed immediately. Livelihoods would collapse, and the scientists themselves would be blamed for spreading panic over data no one outside their lab could verify. Government agencies that briefly reviewed the material reached the same conclusion. There was no safe way to prove the discovery without risking mass hysteria or catastrophic intervention. If the creatures were as large and territorial as the evidence suggested, an attempt to hunt or capture them could wipe out entire sections of the ecosystem. The official decision was simple, but devastating. Stop the work, seal the data, and leave the lake undisturbed. Privately, some scientists agreed with the decision. They believed the species had survived precisely because it was left alone. Others called it cowardice. But by the end of that month, the research budget was frozen, and no further expeditions were authorized. The findings were never submitted to any journal. The project ended quietly, erased through bureaucracy rather than secrecy. Now, fragments of the study have begun to surface. Data tables, field notes, and partial summaries appearing in private forums and research circles. No one knows who released them, but their contents suggest the truth is starting to slip beyond official control. If the reports are real, how long before someone goes back to confirm them? If the predators are still alive, how deep are they hiding now? And if they rise again, who will be watching when the ice begins to move? What do you think about this discovery? Comment down below.